Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of Speaking for the Unborn. And now it's time for a little science. We'll begin with week 1 of embryology, and we're going to cover the whole thing in only 30 seconds. The beginning of life. Here we go. The ovary releases an egg. Fertilization of the egg then occurs in the fallopian tube. And at this precise moment, a living human being has been created, which science calls a zygote. The zygote then begins dividing, becoming a morula, and then a blastocyst, which then implants in the uterus around day 7 and is now called an embryo. Congratulations, take a bow. You now know more than 99% of the world about week 1 of embryology. Now just a few more scientific terms. The unborn is an embryo from the end of week 1 through the end of week 8, and a fetus from the end of week 8 until birth. And I put an asterisk here because all of us know, pro-life or pro-choice, that the real term for fetus is baby. And I can prove this fact with 2 simple statements, 2 sentences you'll never hear even the most fiercely pro-choice pregnant woman excitedly tell her friends. You just have to see the cute ultrasound pictures of our little fetus. Or, we've finally decided to name our fetus Ashley. Clearly she and everyone else knows Ashley is the name of her baby. It's only a fetus when we want to destroy it. Next is the term viability, which we've already touched on. It's the potential for a baby to survive outside the uterus, but not unassisted. It's the potential to survive with the support of state-of-the-art medical care. This means that viability depends not only on the maturity of the unborn baby, but also on the available technology where the baby happens to be born. So what's viable, for example, in New York might not be viable in South Sudan. It's now time to talk about the most important definition in the pro-life movement, that being life itself and when it begins. Contrary to what the pro-choice movement argues, the concept of whether or not something is alive or living does not involve theoretical or religious or philosophical introspection. The definition of life or what is alive is a purely scientific question that science has fully settled. There are fully established criteria that are required to be considered alive. They include characteristics like cellular organization, reproductive capacity, the ability to grow and metabolize, etc. You can memorize the list if you want, but the point is simply that the definition of life is a scientific one, not some esoteric philosophical inquiry based on personal whim. And there's overwhelming scientific consensus that all of these criteria are met at conception. In fact, this past year, the largest survey of biologists ever conducted on this issue was published. Biologists at over 1,000 worldwide institutions were asked whether or not, quote, life begins at conception, and nearly 6,000 biologists responded. And the results are unambiguous. A full 96% agree that life begins at conception. Now, the pro-choice movement fiercely objects to this survey, claiming there must be some bias in the research. And they're right. There is a bias in the survey, but it's a bias against the pro-life cause, not for it, as these biologists self-describe themselves as overwhelmingly liberal, pro-choice, and non-religious. So to say it one last time, the definition of life is a scientific question that science has fully settled. Life begins at conception. Now this brings us back to Roe v. Wade, and one of those criteria we mentioned earlier about overturning precedent. That is, quote, a changed understanding of relevant facts. The Roe court said, at this point in the development of man's knowledge, this court is not in the position to speculate as to the difficult question of when life begins. Well, as we now know, when life begins is not at all a difficult question, and perhaps one the Supreme Court will now have to revisit. Now we get to spend a few minutes on one of the more pleasant parts of this talk, developing babies and some baby pictures. First, let's briefly review a few developmental milestones during pregnancy. On day 1, as we've made clear, we have a living human being. By week 5, there's a visible and audible heartbeat. At week 6, brain activity is now present. By week 9, the baby's moving like crazy, stretching, sighing, sucking its thumb. By week 13, the fetal body is clearly sensitive to touch, perhaps even sooner. And at week 21, we now have the potential for viability, which I'll address in just a few minutes. And remember that Rose said viability was at 28 weeks, and Casey said 23 or 24 weeks. And now it's time for some baby pictures. I've included some images and videos of both embryos and fetuses so you can fully appreciate what we're actually talking about. And I've made most of them available for download onto your phones or computers so you can share them with your pro-choice friends and family members. These beautiful images and videos often surprise people who until the moment they see these photos had always believed such living beings were fully disposable. You can download these images at speakingfortheunborn.org. This stunning image, courtesy of Dr. Stephen O'Connor, is an 8-week-old baby, head, body, arms, and legs, and at this age would already have a beating heart and brain activity. And here's a close-up at week 10 taken by Leonard Nilsson and licensed for us to use, which beautifully reveals the details of the baby's face, eyes, nose, arms, and delicate fingers. Also at week 10, here we see the full body of the baby located in its amniotic sac. Note the umbilical cord which tethers the baby to its mother. Again, a moving image, because it clearly shows what's obviously a baby, and at only 10 weeks. Another view of an unborn child, here between 11 and 12 weeks. The anatomic detail is stunning. And please remember, unless people are given the opportunity to see these images, they can never fully appreciate how developed the unborn child is at so young an age. Clearly, this is no mere clump of cells. Again, evidence of beautiful and advanced anatomic development at only 13 weeks. I love this photo of the blood vessels in this child and the fully formed feet and toes. During my wife's pregnancies, she likes to say she's making feet for socks, and she's right. Another beautiful photo, here at 16 weeks. Just look at the complexity of the face, the hands, the fingers, the knuckles, the nail beds. And here at 20 weeks, my personal favorite, clearly a beautifully formed baby. Not much different than any newborn you've ever seen or held. Yet this living child can be aborted, dismembered alive in any state for any reason. And this is Lila, born prematurely at 21 weeks in San Antonio, only 1 week older than the baby we just saw in the last photo. And remember, instead of allowing her birth, her mother had the legal right to abort her at that very moment. But because of her mother's noble decision, this is Lila, thriving at age 4. Next is an MRI of twins at 20 weeks. The smaller guy clearly wants to stretch, annoying his larger brother, who then tells him off. You can actually see his mouth moving there. And here's an MRI at 24 weeks. This very cute clump of cells has a fascination with her toes. You can see her playing with them. MRI has become a powerful tool in the pro-life movement because it beautifully reveals with stunning detail exactly what's moving around inside a mother's uterus, a living baby. Now, this next video is a bit graphic, but I show it not to horrify you. It's not from an elective abortion. It's what's called an ectopic pregnancy, meaning this pregnancy never made it into the uterus. Most ectopic pregnancies get stuck in the fallopian tube. These pregnancies cannot survive and can be a true life-threatening emergency for the mother and sadly cannot be allowed to continue. I include it here because so many of my pro-choice friends will make comments like this. Okay, Steve, at 26 weeks, maybe it's a baby. But at 8 weeks, give me a break. It's just meaningless tissue. Well, here's that meaningless tissue. Just look at this small baby. Head, body, hands and feet, tiny delicate fingers and toes, moving, kicking, struggling to live. At only 8 weeks of life, we are clearly witnessing a living human baby. How tender and deeply moving. I'd ask each of you to please download this video and politely show it to your pro-choice friends if the opportunity ever arises. Images and videos like these can change hearts in a manner that clever words or arguments never will. Now, intraoperative videos and fancy MRIs are amazing tools, but the real game changer in the pro-life movement has been a routine study nearly every woman gets during pregnancy, fetal ultrasound. Here, by the way, we see the beautiful anatomic detail of the profile of the baby's face, chin and lips, nose and forehead. With ultrasound, everyone has access to a true window into the uterus. And this window has made it undeniably clear that those clumps of cells, well, are not really just clumps of cells, right? This is simply high-definition evidence of the truth. This is clearly a baby. Here we see the lips and the ears and the mouth and the chin and arms and hands and fingers and legs and toes. And this guy, well, he's just thrilled you're on his side. And here we see this guy stretching a bit and then relaxing with, of course, a tasty thumb in the mouth. And note, by the way, the very strong, very audible, and very visible heartbeat. Or, I mean, as the New York Times says, those embryonic pulsations. And the truth evident in these images can shock even the most strident abortion advocate, as they find it hard not to use the word baby when they see these images. And now with 3D ultrasound, the truth is even more dramatic. As you can see, there's just not much difference between pre-birth and post-birth photos. Now, up until this point, we've been speaking around the issue of abortion, but we've really not said much about it. This part of the talk, then, though very unpleasant and uncomfortable, is necessary if we're to effectively advocate for the unborn. Let's begin with a few basic facts and definitions, some of which we've already touched on. First, as we've clearly demonstrated, life begins at conception. We also know that abortion is an intentional act, one that ends a human life. Now, the pro-choice movement fiercely objects to me using the word child prior to birth, but there's simply no grounds for this objection, as demonstrated by every household dictionary. Here's Merriam-Webster's definition. A child is an unborn or recently born person. Clearly, then, the unborn are children. Now, this next word is controversial in the pro-life world, killing. It's obviously severe, harsh, and deeply upsets the pro-choice crowd. But its definition is clear and simple and fully applies to the act of abortion. To kill is to cause the death of a living creature. For me personally, I often use the word because it's honest, it's accurate, and it goes right to the ugly truth of the matter. I've found there are times when this word is very useful, but there have also been times when I've really regretted using the word. So use it with caution and prudence. And by the way, I think a reasonable alternative is, quote, ending the life of the unborn. This now brings us to what I've come to believe is the most accurate and useful definition of abortion. Abortion is the intentional killing of an unborn child. If this definition works for you, memorize it and be ready to use it. And this definition is not out of mainstream thinking. Even Merriam-Webster defines abortion as the termination of a pregnancy resulting in or followed by the death of an embryo or fetus. Planned Parenthood, of course, conveniently omits that death thing, calling it simply a safe and legal medical procedure that, quote, ends a pregnancy. Again, this is rhetorical deception, just like their famous restoring your period or rendering women unpregnant. No, abortion is the intentional killing of an unborn child. Memorize it and be ready to use it. And please don't let anyone tell you that abortion is healthcare. We all know what healthcare is. It's treating the diabetic or setting the broken bone or performing open heart surgery. Killing living human beings has nothing to do with healthcare. Now it's time for the most difficult and unpleasant part of this talk, the abortion procedures themselves. But if we want to spread the truth, we have to first learn the truth, and that means we have to know exactly what happens during the course of an abortion. There are 5 types of abortions, and we'll go through each one in some detail in a minute. They are medical abortions, which are performed up to the 10th week of pregnancy. Dilatation and curettage, or D&Cs, this most common type of abortion is performed between 5 and 13 weeks of pregnancy, meaning into the early 2nd trimester. Dilatation and evacuation, or D&Es, performed in the 2nd trimester between 13 and 24 weeks. Induction abortions, which are 3rd trimester abortions, performed between 25 weeks and term, a time, remember, we've already mentioned when abortion is never medically necessary. And lastly, partial birth abortion, which we'll discuss a bit later in this presentation. Now, let's briefly review at what stages of pregnancy most abortions are performed. The vast majority of abortions are performed in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Just under 10% are performed during the 2nd trimester. And about 1.3% are performed after viability, which we've now shown to be around 21 weeks. Now, some people argue that 1.3% is such a small number that we should focus our attentions elsewhere. But the fact is, 1.3% of abortions since Roe v. Wade is not at all a small number. In fact, 1.3% of 61 million is over 750,000 viable children aborted since Roe. And to give you a feel for how big that number is, I like to visualize it as people in a stadium. And those 1.3% of abortions would fill over 9 stadiums. That's 9 stadiums of dead children. And the most horrifying fact is the majority of these late-term abortions are not performed because of severe deformity or non-viability. The majority of these late-term abortions are performed on healthy babies of healthy mothers. This brings us to the end of part 2 of this presentation. Again, I thank you for your kind attention.